Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Erik Olsen at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I would like to thank the American Center for hosting me this evening. This is going to be the third lecture in my presidential lecture series, Lincoln, Slavery, the Civil War, and His Legacy. I'll talk about Lincoln for about 30, maybe 40 minutes, and when I get finished, I'll be happy to answer questions that anybody has. So let's get started. Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States. He was born on the 12th of February in 1809 in a small cabin in Ogdenville, Kentucky. Coming from a very impoverished background, Lincoln was a self-taught lawyer who practiced in the state of Illinois. And it was in Illinois that his political career began. First, he was a prominent member of the then Whig Party, under whose banner he served for 12 years in the Illinois House of Representatives. But throughout Lincoln's early political career, the most pressing national debate going on was, surprise, surprise, the slavery issue. This was an issue that was hotly contested between Northern and Southern voters, between Whig, then Republican Party members and their opponents in the Democratic Party in the South, and it really revolved around three main questions. The first was, should a slave economy exist alongside the so-called free labor economy? Slave economy in the South, free labor economy in the North, in the industrial sector. Should slavery be restricted only to those states where it still existed? Or, of course, should slavery be abolished completely? Now, most parties understood that if slavery had not expanded, it was going to die out. And so, much like we talk about modern capitalism and corporations, that in order to survive, they must expand, they can't remain stagnant, really the same situation existed for the institution of slavery. It must expand to other states, otherwise it would slowly die out. And this was, of course, great concern to Southern plantation owners. Next slide, please. Let me say some comments first on the Whig Party. The Whig Party was created as opposition to President Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party. Jackson, of course, is one of the presidents I discussed in the last lecture. Whig was a term borrowed from the Revolutionary period in 1776 and stood for opposition to tyranny. Now, their basic platform was the supremacy of Congress over the presidency. Modernization of the economy that included banking reforms, forms of protectionism, and other elements to stimulate the economy. This was largely a party of the wealthy and included both large-scale farmers and economic entrepreneurs. Not surprisingly, this was not a platform that was necessarily appealing to poorer people, poor workers, or certainly subsistence farmers. Historian Frank Towers wrote The Divide Between These Two Parties, and I'm going to quote him, "Democrats stood for the sovereignty of the people as expressed in popular demonstrations, constitutional conventions, and majority rule as a general principle of governing, whereas the Whigs advocated the rule of law, written and unchanging constitutions, and protections for minority interests against majority tyranny." Now, when we talk about minority interests versus majority tyranny, they're not talking about racial minorities, they're not talking about religious minorities. What they're specifically talking about here are people of wealth, the minority, versus the great majority of people who are without wealth. And the fear, and this goes back to the beginning of the Republic, the fear was that if the majority were allowed an equal voice in the affairs of governance, they would simply vote out the wealth of the minority. And this goes back even pre-United States. So the Whig Party was eventually disbanded in 1850 over internal tensions concerning the expansion of slavery into new territories. Most Northern Whigs gravitated to the new Republican Party that began, and of course still exists today, while others left politics completely, and still a few more became Democrats in the South. Now, Lincoln was among the group that left politics, and for Lincoln at least, it was just for a little while. Next slide, please. the House Divided speech of June 1858. Now, this was the year that Lincoln officially returned to politics, upon his acceptance for the Republican nomination to the U.S. Senate. As a result, on the 16th of June, 1858, on the steps of the Illinois State Capitol in Springfield, he gave his most famous pre-war speech. Lincoln's aim was to galvanize anti-slavery support in the North by prophetizing about the future of the nation if questions about the future of slavery was left unresolved. Lincoln purposely utilized a religious tone in his speech in order to gain a moral superiority over the slave faction. Now, I'm going to briefly quote the piece of scripture that he borrowed from, and then we can compare it to at least a portion of Lincoln's speech. So in the Gospel of Mark 3:25, Jesus stated, "And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand," in response to the scribe's claim that by the prince of the devils casteth he out devils. Now, borrowing from this scripture, this is the portion of his speech. "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it should become lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south." Next slide, please. Now, this was obviously a very leveled attack on the institution of slavery. This led to what was called the LincolnDouglas Debates, or the Great Debates of 1858. They were a series of 7 debates between Lincoln and U.S. Senate incumbent Stephen Douglas, who was a Democrat. The subject of the debates, unsurprisingly, was the state of the institution of slavery, and it would foreshadow issues that Lincoln would face during the Civil War. Senator Douglas was a champion of what had become known as popular sovereignty, which allows local populations to vote in favor of or to ban slavery in new territories. Now, we should remember in 1858, the composition of the United States is not what we see it now. Past about the middle of the country, from the east to about the middle states, the states were actual states. Beyond that, areas like Kansas, Nebraska, certainly further westward, these were officially territories. So they were controlled by the federal government, but they were not actually sovereign states like the ones east of them. So the issue that Douglas brings up is that these new territories could either, the people who were living there, of course, could vote whether they wanted that to be a slave territory or a free territory. Now, this was formerly the realm of federal jurisdiction, where the federal government just decided this, not the people living there. Douglas not only supported this idea conceptually, but he was the primary agent in seeing the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 that provided for exactly this. Now, Lincoln, for his part, was a supporter of the so-called Wilmot Proviso. This was a measure that sought to deny slavery in any new territories in the United States and to confine it only to those states that were currently slave states. Now, going back to what I said just a moment ago in the previous slide, slavery would have to expand or it would slowly die. And so this was a de facto death sentence to the institution of slavery, even in the states that it existed. It would simply eventually die out, 1, 2, certainly by 3 generations. Now, with most political disputes, the Lincoln-Douglas debates became an ugly affair of recriminations made on both sides. Douglas, for his part, tried to stoke fears in constituents that Lincoln was covertly trying to, quote unquote, mix the races, and that Lincoln's real goal was the total abolition of slavery. Um, Now, Lincoln, of course, accused Douglas of being part of a cabal that sought nothing less than the full nationalization of slavery in the United States. These were obviously really polarized positions for the two politicians to take. After a contentious campaign and a razor-thin decision by observers, Lincoln would go on to lose these debates and eventually the election of 1858. But sometimes our losses become our greatest benefits. So while Lincoln lost the debates and lost, of course, the race for the Senate, the debates itself had immeasurably raised his national profile. People were talking about Lincoln, writing about Lincoln, rallying behind Lincoln, and it made him a viable candidate for the presidential election of 1860. Now, this is, of course, an interesting event, not merely how it helped articulate and mature Lincoln's stance within the national debate of slavery, but it offers an interesting possibility of what may have occurred only a few short years later had Lincoln actually won that Senate seat and, of course, then not run for the presidency. Maybe he would have, maybe he wouldn't. But the loss really opened up the door because senators serve 6 years. So he would be serving until 1863, 1864. But unless he decided to then give up his Senate seat and then run for the president in 1860, he would have already been occupied. So maybe the history of the United States, at least for those period of the early 1860s, would have been completely different had Lincoln actually won. Next slide, please. Now, the Civil War, we often think about this as a war of the South rebelling against the North, keeping their institution of slavery, and the opponents being the abolitionists in the North. And this is certainly a very legitimate way to look at it. But I want to offer an alternate understanding, that this was not merely a question over the moral value of slavery versus freedom, but really this is a war of two dueling economies. So if anybody is familiar with Western films, and you see kind of the dusty town and the bad guy and the good guy, two cowboys are facing off in the middle of the street and they're about to have a gun battle, and someone says, "This town is not big enough for the two of us." Well, this is much the same situation that was occurring in the United States in the middle of the 19th century. The country simply was not able to manage two fundamentally different and in some ways competing economies. So when one mentions either President Lincoln or the American Civil War, it's impossible not to think of one when the other is mentioned. The beginning of the Civil War didn't merely coincide with the election of Lincoln, but it actually happened because of it. There's little question or debate that slavery was, of course, the main issue for these parties. But as part of his election campaign, Lincoln's Republican Party openly supported a total ban of slavery in all new territories in the United States. So that was their position. He was, of course, as the president, the leader of the Republican Party, and he was the banner holder. And so now the leader of the party that is simply campaigning to abolish slavery in all areas of the United States is now the president and in control of one of the branches of government. Southern and other slave states rejected this position as a violation of their constitutional rights. And upon Lincoln's election, these states immediately moved towards secession. Now, despite this position on slavery, Lincoln also stated that he would not move to abolish slavery where it already existed. And this is an important point to understand. As part of his 4 March 1861 inaugural address to the nation, he stated, "I have no purpose directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the United States where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. But despite those words, there was very little trust in the southern states for Lincoln or what his party was intent on doing. So upon his election inauguration, 9 states, all slaveholding states, went into rebellion against the government of the United States of America. They declared secession from the Union and sought to create what they had called the Confederate States of America. This number, of course, rose to 11 as the war raged. Now, open warfare commenced on the 12th of April, 1861, and this was an attack by Confederate rebels on the U.S. fort of Sumter, located in South Carolina, which they took. Despite his earlier position, as the war raged on, Lincoln came to believe that not merely slavery must be abolished, but that the Southern institutions that supported it also had to be destroyed. So this really became, in essence, a life and death struggle for what had been known as the Southern way of life. It just simply couldn't exist anymore. On the 22nd of September, 1862, he delivered the Emancipation Proclamation. In this order, Lincoln freed all the slaves not directly under federal control, i.e., the Confederate states in rebellion. As a result, over 3 million Southern-held slaves were set free by Union armies as they marched and won territory in the South. Now, I just want to mention, not all the states that did not go into rebellion were free states. There were among them some states that still held slaves, but they chose to stay in the Union. Their slaves were not affected by the Emancipation Proclamation. So this was not a proclamation that was covering all slaves in the United States. It was covering all slaves in what is now the rebellion areas of the United States, i.e. the Confederacy. But it left in bondage those slaves that were still in states that were part of the Union. On the 19th of November, 1863, as Union victories mounted, President Lincoln delivered what may be probably his most famous speech of his entire career. And this was at Soldiers National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And of course, is called the Gettysburg Address. I'm going to read a section of it because I think it's important for the listeners to have Lincoln's words. Now, the speech was 3 minutes long and consisted of 272 words. In it, Lincoln stated, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who have gave their lives so that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from those honored dead we take an increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Now, the Civil War finally ended officially on the 9th of April, 1865, in a courthouse called in a place called Appomattox, Virginia. It was almost exactly 4 years after it began. Not only had the Southern rebels been roundly defeated, Southern economy was destroyed. But since most of the warfare, of course, took place in the South, many of its cities lay in ruins. The plantation system was destroyed. Most of the significant infrastructure was simply left in ruins. But as a result of the war, nearly 750,000 men on both sides perished. It was certainly the bloodiest war ever engaged by Americans, and casualties of American deaths in both outnumbered American deaths in both the First and the Second World War combined. Next slide, please. This is the assassination. This is a picture done after the event, but this is the assassination of President Lincoln. And this was on the 14th of April, 1865. So only a few days, approximately 5 days after the Confederate surrender. And what we see in the picture is John Wilkes Booth assassinating Lincoln while he was watching a play with his wife and attaché at what was called the Ford Theater. Lincoln died then the next day at 7:22 a.m. Next slide, please. Now, I want to go over a little bit about the political situation that really followed the demise of Lincoln and, of course, the conclusion of the Civil War. Now, immediately after Lincoln's death, radicalism on both sides dominated the national debate again. The new president, Andrew Johnson, a devout Southerner, faced off with an equally zealous group of Northerners who controlled Congress, who were known as the quote-unquote radical Republicans. Excuse me. At the end of the Civil War, two very different plans for restructuring the nation were offered. Had Lincoln lived, perhaps this would have been a little bit different, but of course we don't know. Andrew Johnson, a former slave owner, was now the president overseeing the post-war nation. Could he live up to Lincoln's ideals? Would he be allowed that opportunity? These were certainly questions that were on people's minds at the time. After the Civil War, Congress was controlled by this group of radical Republicans. During his life, Lincoln was able to exert a certain amount of control over them. And proposed a plan for Reconstruction that looked at treating the rebellious defeated rebellious Southern states as more the reconciliation of family members than treating the defeated. Lincoln looked to Reconstruction as a time of healing. The radical Republicans, however, had a different view. They looked at Reconstruction as an opportunity to teach the Southern rebels a lesson, and they wanted to punish them. In 1864, Congress passed what was called the Wade-Davis Bill, which called for very draconian measures to be carried out in the South. Lincoln vetoed it, and there was not enough support in Congress to overcome that veto. Now, it's conventional wisdom that had he lived, Lincoln would have been able to still continue controlling these radical Republicans. However, his death left a void in leadership, at least in his party. Johnson proposed a plan similar to Lincoln's. However, again, because he was a former slave owner, he was a Southerner, there was deep distrust on both sides. Congress was not very happy with this. The relationship between the two soured very quickly. At the state level, immediately following the Civil War, Southern states passed numerous laws restricting the rights of black people, the newly freed slaves. These were known as the quote-unquote Black Codes. In Mississippi, for example, interracial marriage was not just against the law, but it could be punished by death. Another code restricted the area in which black people could live. For example, black people could not own or rent land outside of an incorporated town. The purpose of this code was to undermine the effort of the federal government, who had promised freed slaves 40 acres and a mule, so that they could become independent farmers. Despite this, many large plantations in the South were confiscated or completely abandoned, and much of this land was put to use to fulfill that 40-acre promise. These actions by Southern states angered Congress, and led by the radical Republicans, Congress passed sweeping legislation during the Reconstruction years. And this is often called radical Reconstruction. Congressman Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens led the first fight and first passed an act to establish what's called the Freedmen's Bureau. And this is actually like a pamphlet that was handed out by pro-slavery defeated Southerners, warning people what the Freedmen's Bureau really was about. And what we can see in the picture, of course, is the destruction of the Southern way of life, white men working very hard, black people simply being lazy and laying about and getting money from the government for free. Now, this welfare argument, by the way, is something that has been used and reused up until the modern day. We have politicians that still use these types of tropes to scare middle and upper class white people that minorities, whether they be black, Hispanic, or whomever, are simply coming to the country or existing in the country on their largesse, on the white people's largesse. And white people are working to pay welfare for lazy people who don't want to work. Obviously, this is a problematic understanding. So, despite the best efforts of President Andrew Johnson to stop this legislation from assisting black people, several significant bills were passed. Now, there was also martial law declared in the South. So the Southern governments were not reconstituted immediately. The Southern state governments, I should say. The federal government mandated martial law throughout all these defeated territories. So it was military government. And because of this, the federal government was able to do virtually what they wanted. Rebellious states could not vote on measures before Congress, and there were enough votes to override President Johnson's vetoes. Next slide, please. Now, I want to look. This is a woodcutting, or I'm sorry, this is a illustration, and this shows Lincoln in his late teens, early 20s, and to kind of illustrate him being a hard worker, somebody who came up from nothing and was able to become president of the United States. And the nickname that Lincoln had was Honest Abe, Honest Abraham. Lincoln had a growing reputation as a moral man and a defender of the indigent. For example, he didn't like to charge people too much money who he knew were poor. Once a man had sent him $25, but Lincoln sent back 10 of it, saying he was being too generous. He was also known at times to convince clients to settle issues out of court, saving them a lot of money and, of course, earning him no fee. An old woman in dire poverty, the widow of a Revolutionary soldier, was charged $200 for getting her $400 pension. Lincoln sued the pension agent and won the case for the old woman. He didn't charge her for her services and, in fact, paid her hotel bill and gave her money for a return ticket home. He and his associate had once prevented a con man from gaining possession of a tract of land that was owned by a mentally ill girl. The case took 15 minutes. Lincoln's associate came to divide up their fee, but Lincoln reprimanded him. His associate argued that the girl's brother agreed on the fee ahead of time, and that the brother was completely satisfied. Lincoln, and I'm going to quote what he said, "That may be," Lincoln said, "but I am not satisfied. That money comes out of the pocket of a poor, demented girl, and I would rather starve than swindle her in this manner. You return half that money at least, or I'll not take a cent of it as my share." Lincoln didn't talk very much about religion. Even among his best friends, his most intimate acquaintances. He didn't belong to any church, specifically. But he once confided in a friend that his religious code was the same as an old man he knew from Indiana, who said, "When I do good, I feel good. When I do bad, I feel bad. And that is my religion." Next slide, please. So here we have an interesting side-by-side picture. On the one side, we see Zeus on his throne in the Temple of Zeus in Olympia, Greece. On the right side, of course, is the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Certainly we can see that there was some attention paid by the people who created the Lincoln Memorial to the one that that existed in Greece. And this was very much a very conscious act. So Lincoln was known as the Great Emancipator because of the Emancipation Proclamation and the popular understanding that he freed all the slaves. And what we see here is really the deification of Lincoln, making him into a god, making him into a man greater than a man. In The Real Lincoln by Thomas DiLorenzo, the author had some disagreement with this image of Lincoln. DiLorenzo was an economist from Loyola College in Maryland. And like any good economist, DiLorenzo likes to follow the money. He subscribed to a historical interpretation of Lincoln less as an emancipator or honest, and much more as an imperialist, using the power of his office to promote an elite agenda driven by ideology. DiLorenzo points out that despite his reputation after his death, Lincoln's ambivalence towards slavery is very well documented. Lincoln had said that he would, if he could save the Union without freeing a single slave, he would do so. As an old Whig Party devotee of people like Henry Clay, Lincoln was an enthusiastic supporter of Northern-run economic arrangements, which called for high protective tariffs, a centralized banking system, and internal improvements. Internal improvements was a euphemism for corporate welfare, that the government should be subsidizing wealthy businesses with more money. When the Whig Party imploded in the mid-1850s, Lincoln switched to the Republican Party, writes DiLorenzo, but assured his Illinois constituents that there was no difference between the two. When Lincoln finally attained the presidency, he was at last in a position to reward the interest that backed his political career. Unfortunately, such subsidies were an expensive proposition, especially for the small federal government that existed in the 19th century. Lincoln needed all of the tax revenue he could get, and Southern secession was a threat to this revenue system. DiLorenzo notes, by 1860, the Southern states were paying in excess of 80% of all tariffs. And although Lincoln did enact the first unconstitutional income tax during the war, prior to the war, the tariff was virtually the only source of income for the federal government. Without the southern ports that received most of the country's imports, Lincoln could not possibly mount his campaign for a larger federal government and handing out subsidies to industrial interests. DiLorenzo makes a persuasive case that Lincoln's heroic reputation is somewhat undeserved. Lincoln is the father of the centralized state, the architect of unrestricted warfare, and the president who, more than any other, helped bring an end to the republic that the founding fathers had created. It's well documented that Lincoln regarded slavery as an evil, harmful institution, but it's also true that he shared the conviction of most Americans at the time, and of many prominent statesmen before and after him, that blacks could not be assimilated into white society. He rejected the notion of social equality among the races and held to the view that black people should be resettled abroad. As president, he supported projects to remove black people from the United States. Next slide, please. And this concludes my lecture on Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, and the aftermath. Certainly open to questions, if anybody has them. No questions? Oh. Our first question. Could you please tell more about the differences between Southern and Northern economies? Sure. Um, so, a gentleman who was, let's call him the leading apologist for the Southern states and the slave economy, his name was George Fitzhugh. And he wrote a book about the 1830s called Cannibals All. And what he tried to talk about was the benefits of a Southern slave economy over the problems in a Northern, quote-unquote, free economy. And so what Fitzhugh had basically said was that the people in the North were the anti-Negro racists, not the people in the South. The people in the South still had human relationships with their slaves. They looked after their welfare, made sure they were taken care of, because they owned them. Where in the North, the problem was free labor was sold sometimes on day-by-day basis, which is to say you were only employed as well as you were able to work to your fullest. And you could be simply discarded as quickly as anybody else because there were so many replacements for you. And so you had to effectively kill yourself in order to secure work, and this was only on a temporary basis. So let me use an example. Let's say I own a car, and someone else rents a car, and we look at that car in 5 years. Well, because I own the car, I have an interest in taking care of it. I want to make sure that the car is kept repaired. I want to make sure that the car is able to run. But if I rent the car, well, who cares? I'm going to give it back in 5 years. It's somebody else's problem. And so this is at least what Fitzhugh was talking about. Now, of course, this is not an argument in favor of slavery, but it did bring to light many critical problems in the quote-unquote free economy. Sometimes when we look at libertarian positions today, we discuss like a freedom to die, a freedom to die from a lack of health care if you're not willing to essentially become what's called a wage slave. So in the Southern states, it was called chattel slavery, chattel being property. But observers and critics of the Northern economy and what became the dominant economy in the United States discuss working people as wage slaves. You're simply trading your time and your skills for a wage. And certainly when we get to Marxist philosophers not so long after this, the understanding, of course, is that labor does not get back as much production as they create. And that this is stolen by people who own capital. So that would be the primary differences. And of course, the size of the two economies can't be compared. Many, many, many tens of thousands of miles longer of railway line was in the North and in the South. The industrial capacity of the North far surpassed the South. Populations in the North far surpassed the South. And of course, another benefit that the Union Army had is that as Irish people were fleeing Ireland and coming to the United States, they were conscripted practically right off the boat, sent onto another boat, and sent off to battlefields. And so this was just not a benefit that the Southern states had. Now, the mentality and what the South thought that they had was the understanding that cotton was king. This was a slogan that the Southern states like to express. And they thought that the industrialists in England would come to their aid because they would lose the supply of cotton if the South lost. This did not materialize, of course. Let me take the next question. Do you know any myths about Lincoln? Well, I think that I try to discuss them a little bit. The difference between what Lincoln really did and, let's say, this idea of him being the great emancipator. So probably the biggest myth, of course, is that Lincoln had freed all the slaves. This just simply is not true. But this is a common perception that people have. Thank you for your presentation. If the North had lost the Civil War, how long do you think it would have taken the U.S. to abolish slavery? What would be the reasons for the abolition in this case? I'll be frank, I think it's just virtually impossible for the North to have lost. The only way that the northern states would have lost the war is if they simply lost heart and said, "We're not committed to this. We don't want to do this." This was not in any way the political understanding at that time. As much as the South was committed to secession, the northern Union states were equally as committed to maintaining the Union. So that being said, I just don't see really a possibility where the southern states could have won. They just didn't have the manpower, didn't have the industrial base, didn't have the support, didn't have the money. It was not a question if they would lose, how long it would take for it to happen. I think abolition was just going to be natural progression in the historical record. We saw that not long before, England had finally outlawed slavery in the United Kingdom. And this was after, obviously, a very long history of this. These ideas were taking root in Western Europe. And so I think it was really an inevitable proposition. Was the Southern economy much richer than the Northern one before the Civil War? Absolutely not. They're obvious. We have this conception of the Southern plantation and Southern plantation life, and there were indeed very, very, very rich landowners. But there were equally as many, many, many poor white people who were subsistence farmers. They farmed. The production of their farms was enough for them to live on, not enough for them to have any sizable surplus to sell to make a profit, unlike the plantation farmers. Whereas in the North, industrialization by the 1860s was well on its way. There were railroad magnates, there were steel magnates, there were magnates, industrialists, rich people, business people. There were meatpacking magnates. There were lumber magnates. There were, the Industrial Revolution was just absolutely well on its way. And the economic might of the North compared to the South is just incomparable. The North had everything in its favor. The South, for all intents and purposes, had everything against it. As I was saying before, when the United States was an agrarian nation, and this was really what George Washington had a vision for the United States, to be a country that supplies grain, cotton, tobacco, other industrial products to other parts of the world. And had it stayed in this state, which of course we understand that this is not what progress is, okay, maybe things would be a little bit more even. Very rich farmland. In the North, you have much colder seasons. You're not able to grow year round. And so you had definitely a very different situation had all the states or the entire country remained more or less agrarian. But again, with industrialization, the benefits that the North had for industrialization became very clear. Huge cities, huge amounts of people willing to work for very little money. More industrialization happening after that, and the feeling that in the South, that this cotton is king mentality was fooling themselves. I think the Southern leadership was fairly delusional in thinking that what was okay or understood or was a trump card in, let's say, the beginning of the 19th century, by the middle of it, the situation had completely changed. That they were really living in, let's call it borrowed time. The slave economy was on borrowed time for, effectively all the reasons that I mentioned. It just simply was not able to go on. And of course, I should say that the importation of new slaves was put on hold. So this was part of the reason why, if slavery wasn't expanding, it was going to contract and eventually go away. Now, I should say that there were a whole host of laws. So we have de jure and de facto. So de jure is by law. De facto is effective by custom. And so slavery was de jure law before the Civil War, but in many cases it was de facto law after the Civil War ended. That black people were put into positions where they became tenant farmers, and they would have to pay so much to rent equipment and the farmland and everything else, and paid so little for their output that they, for all intents and purposes, just stayed in slavery. This is why even today, the difference in the economic system or the economies when you compare southern states to northern states, southern states are historically very poor. Education system is very ill-funded. The difference, let's say, my home state of New York, we have a vast university system. More than a dozen major universities. And if you look at, let's say, Mississippi or Alabama or Arkansas, you have a handful of universities that are state schools that are, and of course, public schooling by state. Very hard to compare the two. Much better education in the northern states than the southern ones, even today. Let me take the next question. I said that Abraham Lincoln had the nickname Honest Abe. However, I remember from some documentation that he won an election in not an exactly honest way. Is that true? Can you tell us more? I'm not exactly sure what election you mean. I think that the moniker of Honest Abe goes kind of back to what we were talking about, the mythology or the deification of figures. So much like in my second lecture when we looked at George Washington and the oculus in the Capitol building that kind of makes him a god with other gods surrounding him. Obviously, George Washington was not a god. He did not float up in the sky. He did not have other gods around him. Much the same thing was done with Lincoln. And I think this was much more the idea of the great emancipator, of Honest Abe. This was as really much more addressing a need of the country post-Civil War. And the fact that he was murdered, the fact that he was assassinated, that it really had anything to do with the man himself. There were the seeds of these things, of course, but I mean, I have no doubt that, and there are many Lincoln scholars, no doubt that we can certainly find things in his history. I'm not exactly sure which election you're talking about, but we can certainly find skeletons in his closet. There was some rumor for a while that Lincoln was homosexual, and he had a relationship with somebody in his 20s. And so in the Republican Party today, the homosexual caucus is called the Log Cabin Republicans. And this is an allusion to the log cabin that Lincoln grew up in. So whether this is true or not, I can't say. But certainly there's talk of figures, after their death as things become noticed. I should say that it's hard to overstate how important the assassination of Lincoln was in creating the Lincoln myth. So, of course, he would be remembered for successfully keeping the Union together, for being the president that oversaw the shift between a dual economy to a single economy, the emancipation, at least of some slaves. But I'm not sure if Lincoln in memory would be nearly as powerful if he had not been assassinated. Much in the way, and it'll be in a later lecture, I think 2 lectures from now, I'll talk about John Kennedy. John Kennedy, was made by the assassination. He was certainly a charismatic man, an important president, was president during a critical period of American history, certainly in relation to the Cold War. But the assassination made the Kennedy myth, much in the way that the assassination of Lincoln really cemented the Lincoln myth. There are some people who, let's say, when they talk about Jesus in the Bible, that the crucifixion and death of Jesus really cemented the story together, that it was very different from other religions that were contemporaneous to it. And so the death of important figures, we can see this in various various figures in history, really cement who they were. And of course, also, not in the case of Jesus, of course, but talking more historical figures, tends to change our perception of them and make them greater than they were. Do we have any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much, American Center, for hosting me tonight. Thank you for the kind questions from the viewers. And next month we'll be announcing the next lecture, well, sometime soon, but next month we'll have the next lecture in the series on American presidents. Thank you very much and have a great evening.